Today we're going to be looking at Peter and Jesus meeting him just where he needed to be met. So let's just do a bit of catch up of where Peter is and what he's experienced so far after Jesus dying on the cross and then rising again. So first of all, we look at Easter Sunday morning. He was walking with John and Mary comes running towards them saying that Jesus is gone and they don't know where he is gone. So Peter and John have a little mini race and run down to the tomb, and John gets there first, but Peter comes and he goes into the tomb and finds that Jesus is gone. But on that same day in the afternoon, this is where Jesus appears to the disciples in the locked room, but this is the occasion that Thomas wasn't with them. And then we move then a whole week later, and Jesus then appears to all the disciples, again in a locked room setting, and this time it's with Thomas. And then a few more days pass, and this is where we find Peter. Since Jesus has died, Peter has now seen him twice over approximately 10 to 12 days. So not just thinking about what has physically happened, we also know before Jesus died, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus told him that that's what he was going to do. And in his response, he said, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. But Peter went on to deny Jesus 3 times. And when the rooster crowed, he realised what he'd done and he just wept bitterly. So not only has Peter gone through the experience of Jesus dying and rising again, he's also holding on to this maybe failure of guilt of letting Jesus down when he was so adamant he wasn't going to, but he did. And actually Jesus went on to die for him. So keeping this in mind, he potentially may have been thinking, what did I say? What could I have done differently? Can I go back and undo it? Like sometimes what we do that. He'd seen Jesus alive again, but there was this sense of potentially failure of letting his best friend down. And actually sometimes that's one of the hardest places to be and to move on from. And this is where we pick up the story about Peter in John 21. And what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through the story and we're going to pause for a few moments to see what God is saying through the scriptures and then looking at how it applies to us. So we're starting off in John 21, verses 1 to 3. So afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way, that Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So I just want to pick up on one of the phrases in those verses where Simon says, I'm going out to fish. And Peter goes fishing. Now, remember for Peter, this isn't a hobby for him. This was actually his old life. It was the career that he did before he met Jesus. And maybe at this time, as he's thinking, going back to his old life, that he doesn't feel like he's cut out to be a disciple anymore based on what's happening. So he goes back. He goes back to what's safe. He goes backwards to something that he knows. And I think we can relate to that sometimes. If things are going a bit wrong, sometimes we just want to go back to the place where it felt safe, somewhere that's familiar. And maybe if someone's struggling with their faith, it may be drifting back to old habits. Maybe you're wanting to move forward, but actually the failure's stopping you and you're more comfortable by reverting. So back to Peter, he isn't just fishing, he's retreating. He's going back to the place of where he feels comfortable. And what happens as he retreats into this place which he thinks feels comfortable? It says, but that night they caught nothing. A seasoned, trained fisherman going out fishing all night, no fish. So the reason that kind of, as I was reading through that, I thought to myself, that's because Jesus was not involved. He was reverting back. He was gaining control himself, also he thought. And sometimes, even when things may feel good, as if you've got that comfort, there's still this sense of feeling empty, as Peter would have felt at this time. So the next few verses we're going to look at is verses 4 to 6. So early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. And he said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Now, the first phrase in that verse, in verse 4, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. And Jesus isn't coming to meet Peter and the rest of the disciples in a temple. This isn't a dramatic vision or experience. Jesus is showing up where Peter is, where he's doing his work, on a beach, with Peter feeling in failure. And this is the same for us. God turns up in the mundane. He turns up in your everyday. Your days when you're at work, when you're doing the gardening, if you're cooking and cleaning, if you're driving to pick up the kids. Jesus shows up in the ordinary. He's not just in spectacular. He comes to us in the ordinary. And Jesus calls out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" And they say no. And then he tells them to try again. And suddenly the nets are overflowing to the point that they can't even pull the fish in. But the difference here between the empty nets and the full nets is that Jesus is involved. He's come and met Jesus and the disciples at that point, and the miraculous happens, and they have this abundance of fish. Now the next verse, verse 7. Then the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. And I love that declaration from John. It is the Lord. He recognises who he is. So there was that recognition, but then we have the response of what Peter did. So at this point, Peter jumps into the water, grabs his coat, he's over the side, going straight for Jesus. And he didn't care about what was happening in the boat with this massive load of fish that they were trying to haul in. He was out of that boat because he wanted to get into the presence of Jesus. He wanted to be with him. He wasn't hiding away in his kind of shame and failure. He wanted to draw close because he knew who Jesus was and he wanted to be beside him. So how can we relate to that? Sometimes we don't feel adequate, holding on to actions of the past, not feeling ready to be with God. And maybe you've known Jesus in the past, but something has happened and you've moved further away from him. But God is saying, "Come as you are." Maybe you've never known Jesus personally, and you're wanting to kind of get yourself right or to look like those around you that know Jesus. But God is saying, "Come as you are." Grab your coat and jump over the side of the boat and meet with Jesus, just as Peter did. Peter doesn't wait. He doesn't wait to clean himself up first. He jumps in. He didn't think, "I'll wait until I fix myself first." Because that didn't matter, because his friend was on that shore and had returned and he wanted to be with him. And it's just that, come as you are to Jesus, just like Peter did. Now the next few verses, verses 9 to 14. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, just one verse I'd like to just jump back in the story to, and that is in John 18, verses 25. And this verse says, "Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, 'You aren't one of the disciples too, are you?' He denied it, saying, I am not. Now, the reason I bring up this verse is because I could see the parallel of the situation, that in both occasions, there was a burning fire that they were around warming themselves. And I think this detail matters because that's what Peter would have experienced, and then to be in this same setting around a burning fire to remain warm. He had denied Jesus. But this, as we move on in the story, is looking at where Jesus restores him. So it's the same setting, but there's a different outcome. And I think sometimes healing requires revisiting a place of failure or fear, that a conversation needs to happen, that a moment you may be avoiding or a memory that still stings. Jesus doesn't bring Peter back to shame him. He brings him to restore him. And you'll note, what is Jesus doing? He's making him breakfast. He's showing him hospitality. He's showing him kindness. Jesus goes on to speak to Peter, but at this point in time, I really wanted to just capture that Jesus is feeding him, and that before restoration takes place, there isn't rebuke. There is a safe place to come along with Jesus. Now, the next few verses is verses 15 to 17. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And 3 times he asks, do you love me? Again, replicating what had already happened. 3 times he had denied Jesus, but 3 times Jesus is saying, do you love me? And in this situation, by the 3rd time, Peter is feeling hurt. And he's saying, of course I love you. But this wasn't Jesus trying to punish him or to taunt him. It was allowing him time to heal, to recover from what had happened. And also giving him a new instruction. He was giving him an instruction 3 times to taking care of the sheep. Jesus doesn't want to just leave us in our pain and failure, but he wants to give us a chance to respond, as he gave the opportunity for Peter. Jesus doesn't ignore Peter's failure. He actually comes to transform it. And every time Peter is saying yes, Jesus is responding to that new action of feed my sheep. And this allows Peter to give a response. And from this exchange with Jesus, Peter is being released back into his ministry. The command to feed my sheep. He was commissioning Peter to care for, to love, to teach and protect his followers. To feed the sheep is to tell of what Jesus had done in his life. Jesus had taken the place for everyone on that cross so that everyone could know forgiveness and restoration. Not to go back to an old career of something of the past, but he'd given him a new mantle to return as Jesus had initially intended for Peter, to be a fisher of men. And he was now calling him to share love and feed the people with the news of Jesus. And from this, we can look at what Peter went on to do. As we know, Jesus was ascended. But there's several things that replicated his response, and he committed and did what he said he was going to do. He was one of the leading people at the time of Pentecost, and he delivered a powerful sermon, and 3,000 people came to God, and that was kind of the starting of the church. He performed miraculous miracles of the lame man, worked various signs and wonders through the Holy Spirit. He was the one that took the initiative to appoint a replacement for Judas, so was leading the early church. He acted as a bold spokesperson for the apostles. And even when they were ordered not to preach of God, he declared that we must obey God rather than of men. He expanded the mission. He visited Samaria and Caesarea, and he opened the gospel to the Gentiles, and he fulfilled his role in spreading of the church. He was imprisoned by Herod, but then was freed in a miraculous way. And finally, Peter also wrote 2 epistles, Peter 1 and 2 Peter, and it was in the New Testament that encourages his believers. Now, Peter may have failed Jesus in that moment when he denied him, but it was Jesus that came and restored him. He gave Peter the chance to respond. And Peter certainly followed Jesus' instructions to feed his sheep. And Peter's story wasn't over. And maybe you feel that yours is, but I'm come to say that yours hasn't failed either. Peter's story could have ended in failure, but it didn't, because Jesus rewrote it. And Jesus rewrites our story. We are no longer slaves to sin, but we are free because of what Jesus has done for us through his resurrecting power. And we are new creations in him. And I'd just like to leave with you a few final questions of where you may identify yourself with the story that we've shared. Maybe you feel like you're in the boat and you're feeling stuck and you've gone back to where it's comfortable. Maybe you're in the water trying to get back to Jesus. Or maybe you're around the fire needing restoration this morning. And there's just some words I wanted to end on. That Jesus is not standing at a distance waiting to judge you. He's on the shore, calling you, preparing a place for you. And he's saying the same thing today. Come as you are and follow me.